The house on Elmwood Drive was not just a structure of brick, mortar, and Georgia pine. To Helen, it was a monument. It stood as a testament to 40 years of blood, sweat, and the kind of unyielding resilience that only a black woman born in the Jim Crow South could truly understand. Helen remembered the day she and her late husband, Thomas, bought it in the early 1980s. The neighborhood had been heavily redlined back then. The bank loan officer had looked at Thomas, a hard-working mechanic with calloused hands, and Helen, a newly registered nurse, with a sneer that suggested they were reaching far above their station. But they had saved every penny, fought through the bureaucratic red tape, and claimed their piece of the American dream. They had paid off the mortgage 5 years early. Thomas had laid the hardwood floors in the living room himself, his laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. Now at 68, Helen was a widow. After a 40-year career navigating the chaotic, high-stakes environment of Atlanta General's emergency room, she had retired as head nurse. She had earned her peace. She had earned the right to sit on her wraparound porch, sip her morning coffee, and watch the magnolias bloom in the yard she owned free and clear. That was the plan anyway. But a house as grand as Elmwood Drive rarely stayed empty. When her son Robert and his wife Audrey had hit a rough patch financially a year ago, Helen had opened her doors without hesitation. Family took care of family. That was the rule. She had given them the entire second floor, asking for nothing in return but respect for the home Thomas had built. For the first few months it had been pleasant. But recently the atmosphere in the house had shifted, becoming as thick and suffocating as a Georgia summer evening. And worse, Helen's own mind had begun to betray her. Or so she was told. It started with the small things. A pair of reading glasses misplaced. The television remote found in the refrigerator. A pot of water left boiling on the stove until it evaporated, scorching the metal. Helen had always been a woman of razor-sharp intellect. In the ER, she was known for her photographic memory, able to recall patient dosages and complex medical histories at the drop of a hat. But over the last 3 weeks, a heavy, insidious fog had settled over her brain. She woke up feeling as though she had been dragged through mud. Her limbs felt like lead, her tongue felt thick, and her thoughts moved like molasses. "You're just tired, Mama Helen," Audrey would say, her voice dripping with a sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. Audrey was a woman of meticulous appearances, perfectly highlighted hair, manicured nails, and a wardrobe that suggested a wealth she didn't actually possess. "I'm not tired, Audrey. I'm exhausted, and I can't remember putting those keys in the laundry basket," Helen replied one Tuesday morning, rubbing her throbbing temples. She stared at the keychain sitting incongruously on top of a pile of dirty towels. Robert stepped into the kitchen, adjusting his tie. At 35, he was the spitting image of his father, tall and broad-shouldered, but he lacked Thomas's steady, unwavering gaze. Lately, Robert couldn't seem to look his mother in the eye. "Mom, you're 68, Robert said gently, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. The touch felt less like comfort and more like an anchor pulling her down. "It's normal to get a little forgetful. We've been reading up on it. Cognitive decline can start subtly." Helen stiffened. Cognitive decline. The words felt like a slap. "I do not have dementia, Robert. I was managing a trauma ward 3 years ago." "Nobody is saying the D word, Mama," Audrey chimed in, rushing over with a steaming mug. "We just want you to be healthy. That's why I brewed you your special tea. You know how much it helps you sleep." Helen looked down at the ceramic mug. Every night for the past 3 weeks, Audrey had insisted on brewing her a special herbal blend of chamomile, valerian root, and lavender to help with the supposed stress that was causing her memory lapses. Helen usually drank it gratefully, desperate for a good night's rest. But every morning after drinking it, the fog was thicker. "Drink up, Mom," Robert urged, his tone shifting from comforting to subtly commanding. "You need your rest. You were wandering the hallway at 2 a.m. last night." "Do you even remember that?" Helen froze. She didn't. A cold spike of genuine fear pierced through her chest. Was she losing her mind? Was the brilliant, sharp-tongued Helen Vega fading into an empty shell? I don't," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "See? That's why we're here," Audrey said, pressing the warm mug into Helen's hands. "We'll take care of you." Later that evening, sitting alone in her armchair by the living room window, Helen stared at the fresh cup of tea Audrey had just brought her. The house was quiet. Robert and Audrey had retreated upstairs. Helen held the mug close to her face. It smelled of lavender and chamomile, yes, but underneath the floral notes there was a faint, chalky bitterness, an artificial tang. The fear that had gripped her earlier began to recede, replaced by a cold, analytical clarity. Helen closed her eyes and did what she had done for 40 years. She diagnosed the symptoms. Symptom 1, severe morning lethargy. Symptom 2, anterograde amnesia, forgetting recent events. Symptom 3, dry mouth, heavy limbs, blurred vision upon waking. Symptom 4, the symptoms only began a month ago, coinciding perfectly with Audrey's sudden interest in my nighttime routine. Natural cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, rarely presented with such sudden acute physical heaviness. It was a gradual fading, a slow thief in the night. What Helen was experiencing felt pharmacological. It felt like a chemical hangover. She opened her eyes. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the hardened, pragmatic stare of an ER head nurse. "Nobody tells a nurse how the body works," Helen muttered to herself. Instead of raising the mug to her lips, Helen stood up. Her legs were shaky from the lingering effects of the previous night's dose, but her mind was fiercely focused. She walked over to the large potted peace lily sitting in the corner of the room, a gift from Thomas on their 30th anniversary. With a steady hand, Helen poured the entire contents of the mug into the soil. She then took the empty mug to the kitchen, rinsed it out, and left it on the drying rack. She went to her bedroom, locked the door, and lay down. Without the warm, suffocating blanket of the tea, her mind raced. If she was right, her own flesh and blood was medicating her. But why? The next morning, Helen woke up at 6 a.m. For the first time in nearly a month, she didn't feel as though she was swimming through a sea of wet concrete. Her eyes opened easily. Her mouth wasn't dry. The fog had lifted, leaving behind a crisp, terrifying clarity. She got out of bed, her steps firm and balanced. She walked out to the living room to inspect the peace lily. The plant, which had been vibrant and green just 24 hours ago, was now drooping drastically. Several of its broad leaves had curled inward, their edges tinged with an ugly, sickly yellow. The soil smelled faintly of chemicals. Helen stared at the dying plant. A profound, shattering grief washed over her. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to see the physical proof of betrayal. Robert, her baby boy, the child she had rocked to sleep in this very room, was allowing his wife to poison her. Tears pricked her eyes, but she aggressively wiped them away. She didn't have the luxury of crying. Not yet. "Morning, Mama Helen." Audrey's overly bright voice broke the silence as she trotted down the stairs, dressed in her expensive yoga gear. "How did we sleep?" Helen took a deep breath, instantly dropping her shoulders and letting her face slacken into an expression of confused weariness. The performance of her life had begun. "Oh, morning, Audrey," Helen said, making her voice sound slightly raspy and hesitant. She dragged her feet as she walked toward the kitchen. I think I slept all right, but my head feels so heavy today." Audrey's eyes gleamed with a fleeting, undeniable satisfaction. "That's okay, Mama. You just sit down. I'll make you some oatmeal." Robert came down a few minutes later. He looked at Helen, who was staring blankly at the kitchen table, purposefully missing her mouth slightly as she took a sip of water. "She seems worse today," Robert whispered to Audrey by the stove, though Helen's sharp ears caught every word. "It's a progression, Rob," Audrey whispered back. "We talked about this. We just have to keep her comfortable and safe." "Maybe we need to start looking at those brochures again," Robert muttered, staring at the floor. "Full-time care. If she leaves the stove on again, she could burn the house down." Helen's blood ran ice cold. Full-time care. A nursing home. They were trying to manufacture a medical crisis to have her declared incompetent. If she was put in a facility, Robert, as her next of kin, would gain power of attorney. He would have total control over her pension, her bank accounts, and the crown jewel, the house on Elmwood Drive. Helen kept her eyes glued to her oatmeal, letting a small bit of it dribble down her chin. She slowly wiped it away with a napkin. "You want a confused old woman?" she thought, her heart pounding with a fierce, protective rage. "I'll give you an Oscar-winning performance." That evening, Helen complained of a headache and asked to go to bed early. "Of course, Mama. Let me get your tea," Audrey insisted, hurrying to the kitchen. When Audrey handed over the steaming mug, Helen smiled vacantly. "Thank you, dear. You're so good to me." Helen took the mug into her bedroom and locked the door. She didn't pour it into the plant this time. From her medical bag tucked away in the closet, she pulled out a sterile plastic specimen container. She carefully poured the tea into the vial, sealed it tight, and slipped it into her leather handbag. She poured the rest down the bathroom sink and flushed the toilet to mask the sound. Then she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. At 9 a.m. the next day, Helen told Robert and Audrey she was taking a taxi to the local senior center for a knitting class. "Are you sure you're up for it, Mom?" Robert asked, pretending to look concerned. "You've been so disoriented lately." "The fresh air will do me good, Bobby," Helen said, using his childhood nickname. She gave him a fragile smile. "Besides, I don't want to rot in this house." Once the taxi was 3 blocks away, Helen leaned forward. "Change of destination, please. Take me to Atlanta General Hospital, the rear staff entrance." The hospital smelled exactly as it always had, a sterile mix of industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and cheap cafeteria coffee. To Helen, it smelled like home. She bypassed the main reception, her badgeless presence going unquestioned by the older security guards who still recognized the legendary Nurse Vega. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors down to the basement, heading straight for the pathology and toxicology lab. Sarah, a brilliant lab technician who had worked alongside Helen for 15 years, looked up from her microscope. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, wearing thick safety glasses. "Well, Lord have mercy if it isn't the queen of the ER," Sarah grinned, pulling down her mask. "What brings you out of retirement, Helen? Bored of gardening already?" Helen didn't smile. She walked over, her posture rigid, and pulled the plastic specimen container from her handbag, placing it on the stainless steel counter with a sharp clack. Sarah's smile faded. She looked at the amber liquid, then up at Helen's dead serious eyes. "What is this, Helen?" "I need a favor, Sarah. Off the books. No official hospital records," Helen said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "I need a full mass spectrometry on this liquid. I need to know exactly what's in it, down to the milligram." Sarah frowned, picking up the vial. "You know I can't run unofficial tox screens. If administration finds out—" "Sarah," Helen interrupted, her voice cracking for a fraction of a second before she steeled it again. "Please, my life might depend on it." Sarah studied her friend's face. She saw the exhaustion, the tension, and beneath it all, the raw, unfiltered terror. Without another word, Sarah nodded. "Give me 45 minutes. Go sit in my office." Those 45 minutes were the longest of Helen's life. She sat in the windowless office, staring at a poster of human anatomy on the wall. She prayed she was wrong. She prayed that maybe Audrey just had a heavy hand with some natural valerian root. She prayed that her son had not turned into a monster. The door clicked open. Sarah walked in, holding a printout. Her face was ashen. She closed the door silently and locked it. She sat down across from Helen, sliding the paper across the desk. "Helen," Sarah started, her voice shaking slightly. "Where did you get this?" "Just read me the results, Sarah." Sarah swallowed hard. "It's not herbal tea. There are traces of chamomile, yes, but it's essentially a liquid delivery system for a cocktail of central nervous system depressants." Helen closed her eyes. The medical jargon washed over her, familiar and devastating. "I found highly concentrated levels of diphenhydramine. That's what causes the severe brain fog, memory lapses, and the hangover effect," Sarah explained, pointing to a spike on the graph. "But worse, there's a significant dose of lorazepam in here, an anti-anxiety benzo. Mixed together, this wouldn't just make you sleepy. Taken consecutively over weeks, it would induce symptoms identical to rapid-onset dementia. Confusion, loss of motor control, suggestibility." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with horror. "Helen, whoever is giving you this isn't trying to help you sleep. They are systematically chemically restraining you. They are trying to make you appear medically incompetent." The words hung in the sterile air of the office. Medically incompetent. Helen looked down at her hands. They were strong hands. Hands that had performed CPR. Hands that had delivered babies. Hands that had held her husband as he took his last breath. Now her own son was trying to bind those hands with invisible chemical chains. "Do you want me to call the police?" Sarah asked gently, reaching out to touch Helen's arm. "This is attempted poisoning. This is elder abuse, Helen. We can have detectives waiting at your house in 20 minutes. Helen sat perfectly still. If she called the police now, Audrey would claim it was a mistake. Robert would play the victim. They might get a slap on the wrist, Or worse, they might twist the story to say Helen was already confused and had mixed up her own medications. No, police wouldn't be enough. Police wouldn't protect the house. Police wouldn't expose the full depth of their plan. Helen needed to know how deep this rot went, and she needed to tear it out by the root so it could never grow back. Helen stood up. She carefully folded the toxicology report and placed it securely in her leather handbag. The shock and grief had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating fury. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a woman defending her life and her legacy. "No, Sarah, no police," Helen said, her voice steady, resonant, and dripping with authority. "They think I'm a clueless, senile old woman. Let them keep thinking that." "Helen, what are you going to do?" Sarah asked, alarmed. Helen turned toward the door, her posture perfectly straight. The illusion of the fog was gone forever. "I'm going to let them dig their own graves," Helen said softly. "And then I'm going to bury them." Helen returned to Elmwood Drive that afternoon with the toxicology report folded securely in the secret zipper compartment of her leather purse. She paused on the front porch, taking a deep, centering breath of the humid Georgia air. When she turned the brass doorknob, she left the sharp, formidable head nurse outside. The woman who walked into the foyer was hunched, her eyes slightly vacant, her steps shuffling. "I'm back," Helen called out, her voice thin and wavering. Audrey appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a designer apron. "Mama Helen, you were gone so long. Did you enjoy the knitting class?" "It was loud," Helen murmured, rubbing her forehead. "I couldn't focus. Actually, I called my sister Eleanor from the community center. I think I need to get out of the city for a bit. The air here is making my head spin. I'm going to take the train to Chicago tomorrow to stay with her for a week." Audrey's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing her perfectly made-up face. "Chicago? Mama, are you sure? It's a long trip, and with your recent spells—" Robert descended the stairs, catching the tail end of the conversation. "Mom, you can't travel alone right now. It's not safe." "I am perfectly capable of sitting on a train, Robert," Helen snapped, injecting just enough defensive irritability into her voice to mimic a proud elder in denial of her own decline. "Eleanor's grandson is picking me up at Union Station. I need to see my sister. I've already booked the ticket on the phone." Robert and Audrey exchanged a loaded glance. Helen could practically see the gears turning in their heads. A week without Helen in the house. A week of unfettered access to the property. The panic in Audrey's eyes slowly morphed into opportunistic gleam. "Well," Robert said slowly, adopting a tone of reluctant concession, "if Eleanor's grandson is picking you up, I suppose it might be good for you. A change of scenery." "I'll pack my bags," Helen said, turning toward her first-floor bedroom. That afternoon, while Audrey was out buying groceries and Robert was locked in his home office, Helen executed the first phase of her counteroffensive. Being a head nurse in a chaotic ER meant adapting to new technology rapidly. Digital charting, complex monitoring algorithms, automated dispensaries. She was no Luddite. On her way home from the hospital, she had stopped at a Best Buy and purchased 3 thumb-sized battery-operated Wi-Fi cameras. With practiced efficiency, she synced them to her iPhone. She placed the first one inside a hollowed-out decorative encyclopedia on the living room bookshelf, angling the pinhole lens to capture the front door and the staircase. The second went into the kitchen, tucked behind a row of porcelain cookie jars. The third and most crucial camera was placed in her own bedroom, hidden seamlessly within the dark floral pattern of a decorative tissue box on her dresser. The next morning, Robert drove her to the Amtrak station. He hugged her goodbye, his grip tight, but his eyes avoiding hers. "Call us when you get there, Mom. Be safe." "I will, Bobby," Helen said, patting his cheek. Her hand felt cold against his warm skin. She walked through the station doors, waited exactly 10 minutes by the ticketing counter, and then walked right out the side exit. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver an address just 3 blocks away from her own home. The Starlight Motel was a run-down, brick-faced establishment with flickering neon signs and a lingering smell of stale cigarettes and heavy bleach. It was a far cry from the pristine hardwood and magnolia-scented air of Elmwood Drive. Helen paid for a week in cash, locked the door of room 114, and pulled the blackout curtains shut. She sat at the small, wobbly laminate desk, opened her tote bag, and pulled out her iPad, her phone, and a legal pad. The Starlight Motel was no longer a dingy roadside stop. It was her command center. Helen opened the camera app on her phone. The live feeds buffered for a second before snapping into high-definition clarity. It didn't take long for the charade to drop. At 2 p.m., the front door swung open. Audrey walked in, not with groceries, but with a stack of fresh white hotel-grade towels and travel-sized toiletries. Robert was right behind her, carrying a vacuum cleaner. Through the tiny speaker on Helen's phone, she heard Audrey's voice, crisp and frantic. "We have 4 hours before the weekenders arrive. I need you to scrub the master bathroom. The last reviews said there was water spotting on the glass." I know, Robert grumbled. "Did you change the Wi-Fi password for the guests? Mom almost noticed the network name last week." Helen sat perfectly still in the dark motel room, the blue light of the screen illuminating her hardened face. Weekenders, guests, reviews. She set the phone down and picked up the iPad. When Robert had moved in, his laptop had broken, and he had borrowed Helen's iPad for a month to manage his finances. Helen had never logged him out of the Apple Mail app. She tapped the blue icon. The inbox refreshed, flooding with hundreds of emails. She navigated to the search bar and typed a single word: Elmwood. Dozens of emails populated. Most were from a sender listed as Airbnb Host Services. Helen clicked on the top email. "Congratulations, Robert. You've maintained your superhost status for Elmwood Estate. Your payout of $1,450 for the weekend of April 3rd is on its way." Helen's stomach churned. They weren't just living in her house rent-free, they were pimping it out. Every weekend she was heavily sedated, lost in a chemically induced fog in her bedroom. Strangers were sleeping in her guest rooms, walking on Thomas's floors, using her plates. They were making thousands of dollars off her property, right under her nose. But the illegal hotel operation, as vile as it was, wasn't enough to justify the heavy sedatives. There was a darker motive. Helen typed another keyword into the search bar: medical. A new batch of emails appeared. One thread caught her eye. It was between Robert and an email address ending in https://www.google.com/search?q=sterlingelderlaw.com. The subject line read, Re-inquiry, Emergency Conservatorship. Helen clicked the thread. Her eyes scanned the text, the legal jargon leaping off the screen like venomous snakes. Dear Mr. Vega, based on our consultation, if your mother, Helen Vega, is exhibiting rapid cognitive decline, severe memory loss, and a danger to herself, for example leaving appliances on, wandering at night, we have strong grounds to petition the Fulton County Court for emergency guardianship and conservatorship. To proceed, we require documented evidence of her living conditions and an affidavit from a licensed medical professional confirming her lack of mental capacity. Once conservatorship is granted, you will have full legal authority to manage her health care placement, that is, assisted living, and liquidate real estate assets to cover her care and your administrative fees. Helen stopped reading. The air in the motel room felt thin. Liquidate real estate assets. They were going to sell her home. The home where she had brought Robert back from the hospital as a newborn. The home where Thomas had died in her arms. They were going to strip her of her human rights, declare her legally dead while she was still breathing, lock her in a facility, and sell her life's work to cover Robert's debts. A notification dinged on her phone. Movement detected in the living room. Helen looked at the camera feed. It was now Thursday evening, 8 p.m. The weekend guests hadn't arrived yet. Instead, Robert and Audrey were walking through the front door with a third person. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had a sleazy, calculating demeanor. Helen turned the volume up. "Dr. Aris, thank you for coming on such short notice," Robert said, his voice dripping with faux anxiety. "Of course, Robert," the man replied smoothly. "As a private evaluator, I understand how difficult it is for families dealing with advanced dementia. You mentioned you had visual evidence of her unlivable conditions." "Yes, right this way," Audrey said, leading the men down the hall toward Helen's first-floor bedroom. Helen switched the feed on her phone to the bedroom camera hidden in the tissue box. The door opened. Audrey, Robert, and Dr. Aris stepped into Helen's meticulously kept room. The bed was perfectly made, the floors spotless, the medical books neatly arranged on the desk. "It looks quite tidy," Dr. Aris noted, raising an eyebrow. "She has moments of clarity," Audrey lied effortlessly. "But when she spirals, it's a disaster. Show him, Rob." Helen watched, paralyzed in her motel chair, as her son stepped forward. Robert walked over to Helen's laundry basket. He grabbed a handful of clothes. her blouses, her undergarments, her comfortable slacks, and viciously threw them across the room. He kicked her trash can over, scattering crumpled tissues and old receipts across the hardwood. "She tears the room apart looking for things that aren't there," Audrey narrated, playing the part of the exhausted caregiver. Robert moved to the desk. He swept his arm across the surface, knocking Helen's medical journals, her pens, and a stack of mail onto the floor. He went into her ensuite bathroom and returned with several pill bottles, uncapping them and scattering the white tablets across the rug. "She hoards medication," Robert said, his voice trembling, a brilliant sociopathic performance. "She forgets she's taken them, hides them, and then takes more. We're terrified she's going to overdose." Dr. Aris nodded sympathetically, pulling a digital camera from his briefcase. He began snapping photos of the fabricated chaos. "This is very compelling for the judge. Unsanitary and unsafe living conditions. Clear signs of paranoia and medication mismanagement." Helen's hands gripped the edge of the motel desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were violating her sanctuary. They were turning her disciplined, honorable life into a pathetic, filthy lie for a camera lens. Then Robert stopped. He was standing by Helen's wooden nightstand. Resting on the nightstand was a heavy, sterling silver picture frame. Inside it was a photograph of Helen and Thomas on their 10th wedding anniversary. They were standing on the front porch of this very house, Thomas's arms wrapped tightly around Helen's waist, both of them throwing their heads back in roaring, joyous laughter. Robert stared down at the photo of his parents. For a fleeting, microscopic second, Helen saw a fracture in his demeanor. A shadow of guilt passed over his eyes. He reached out and touched the silver frame. "Make sure you get this," Audrey whispered harshly, stepping up behind her husband. She leaned in. "Make it look like she knocked it over in a rage. The judge needs to see she's destructive." Robert swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He looked at the picture, then looked at his wife. "Don't do it, Bobby," Helen whispered into the empty, dark motel room. "Please, son, don't." Robert closed his eyes, took a breath, and swiped his hand sideways. The heavy silver frame flew off the nightstand. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent, sickening crack. The glass spiderwebbed, shattering across the smiling faces of Helen and Thomas. Dr. Aris's camera flashed, capturing the broken glass. "Perfect. This shows agitation and potential for self-harm," the doctor said, sounding more like a director on a movie set than a medical professional. In room 114 of the Starlight Motel, the silence was deafening. Helen stared at the shattered glass on her phone screen. Something inside her chest, a delicate, hopeful, maternal thread that she had been clinging to for the past 48 hours, snapped with the exact same violent sound. A low, guttural sob tore itself from her throat. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sound, tears spilling over her eyelashes and tracking down her cheeks. She cried for the boy she had raised, who had just died in that room. She cried for the husband who wasn't here to protect her. She cried for the sheer, suffocating agony of ultimate betrayal. She wept until her chest ached, until the live feed showed Audrey and Robert locking the door to her ruined bedroom, leaving the broken glass on the floor for her to discover when she returned from Chicago. For 10 minutes, Helen sat in the dark, letting the grief hollow her out. But Helen Vega was not a woman who stayed hollow for long. In the ER, when a patient flatlined, you didn't stand around crying. You grabbed the defibrillator. You shocked the system. You fought back against the dying of the light. The tears stopped. The trembling in her hands ceased. Helen reached for the box of tissues on the motel desk, wiped her face, and blew her nose. She looked back at the iPad, at the email thread detailing the timeline of the conservatorship hearing. They had scheduled the official medical evaluation, the one that would legally seal her fate, for next Friday. 9 days from now. Helen picked up her phone. She didn't dial the police. She didn't dial Eleanor in Chicago. She dialed a local Atlanta number she knew by heart, a number that belonged to a man who had marched with Martin Luther King Jr., a man who had fought the city to ensure Helen and Thomas could buy the house on Elmwood in the first place. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Marcus Vance, who is calling at this ungodly hour?" "Marcus," Helen said. Her voice was no longer the wavering croak of a confused elder. It was the sharp, commanding bark of a trauma nurse stepping into the fray. "It's Helen Vega." "Helen? Lord, it's been months. Are you all right? You sound—" Marcus trailed off, recognizing the steely undertone. I need your help, Marcus, Helen said, her eyes fixed on the live feed of her son counting Airbnb cash in the kitchen. My son and his wife are trying to declare me mentally incompetent to steal Thomas's house. They've drugged me, they're falsifying medical records, and they plan to lock me in a home. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke again, the sleepy warmth was gone, replaced by the chilling precision of a ruthless litigator. Where are you right now, Helen? I'm at the Starlight Motel on 4th Street. And Marcus? Yes, Helen? Bring your fiercest paralegal, Helen said, closing the iPad with a definitive snap. We are going to war. Marcus Vance did not look like a man who had been woken up at midnight. When he knocked on the door of room 114 at the Starlight Motel, he was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal 3-piece suit, his silver hair brushed back with immaculate precision. Beside him stood a young black woman in her late 20s, holding a sleek silver laptop and a thick leather binder. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the dingy motel hallway with calculating intensity. Helen unbolted the door and let them in. She hadn't slept. The adrenaline pumping through her veins had effectively burned away the last remnants of the chemical fog Audrey had subjected her to. Helen, Marcus said, stepping into the cramped room. His deep baritone voice instantly made the cheap motel feel smaller. He took both of her hands in his. His grip was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm. Look at you. You should be sitting on your porch, not hiding out in a place that smells like cheap gin and despair. I'll get my porch back soon enough, Marcus, Helen said, her voice hard. She gestured to the young woman. Who is this? This is Chloe, Marcus introduced. She's the brightest paralegal and private investigator in my firm. If there is a digital footprint, a hidden bank account, or a buried secret, Chloe will find it. Now sit down and tell me everything. For the next hour, Helen laid out the nightmare. She handed Marcus the toxicology report from Atlanta General. She showed them the saved emails regarding the Airbnb payouts and the correspondence with Dr. Aris about the emergency conservatorship. Finally, she handed her phone to Chloe and played the hidden camera footage. Marcus watched the screen in stoic silence. But when Robert swiped the silver anniversary frame off the nightstand, when the glass shattered over Thomas and Helen's smiling faces, Marcus's jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched. He had known Thomas Vega. They had marched together in Selma. To see Thomas's legacy desecrated by his own flesh and blood was a profound, visceral insult. Elder abuse, forced chemical restraint, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and operating an unlicensed commercial lodging facility. Marcus listed the charges, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Helen, I can have an emergency injunction filed by 8 a.m. I can have a police cruiser at Elmwood Drive by 9 a.m. We can arrest them both before they even have their morning coffee. No, Helen said firmly. Marcus frowned. Helen, they are poisoning you. They were poisoning me. I'm safe now, Helen replied, tapping the motel desk with her index finger. If you arrest them tomorrow, they will claim it was a misunderstanding. Robert will cry to a jury. He'll say he was overwhelmed, that he thought the tea was natural, that he was just trying to pay the bills with the Airbnb. Audrey will play the supportive, naive wife. They'll get probation. And Robert will still be my next of kin. Helen leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Marcus's. I don't just want them out of my house, Marcus. I want them to understand the magnitude of their betrayal. I want them cornered, with no lies left to tell. I want to amputate them from my life completely. Chloe, who had been rapidly typing on her laptop, looked up. There was a glimmer of deep respect in the young woman's eyes. Mrs. Vega is right, Mr. Vance, and I think I just found out why they are rushing this conservatorship. Marcus turned to his paralegal. What did you find, Chloe? Mrs. Vega gave me access to Robert's iPad, which still has his Apple keychain password synced, Chloe explained, her fingers flying across the trackpad. I didn't just look at the Airbnb receipts. I dug into his corporate emails. Robert is a senior portfolio manager at Sterling and Hayes Investments, right? Yes, Helen said, a knot forming in her stomach. He manages retirement funds. Not anymore, he doesn't, Chloe said grimly. She turned the laptop screen toward Helen and Marcus. He's been suspended pending an internal investigation. I found panicked emails between Robert and an offshore debt restructuring firm. Over the last 2 years, Robert has been quietly siphoning money from 3 of his clients' accounts to cover massive losses he took in crypto trading and some very bad real estate bets. Helen felt the breath leave her lungs. How much, Chloe? $215,000, Chloe said softly. An internal audit is scheduled for the end of the month. When the auditors find the discrepancy, they're going to hand him over to the FBI. That's wire fraud and embezzlement. It's a minimum of 10 years in federal prison. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle snapped together with horrifying clarity. Helen closed her eyes. She saw Robert as a 10-year-old boy, crying because he had accidentally broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, terrified of the consequences. Thomas had held him by the shoulders and said, "A man owns his mistakes, Bobby. You don't hide. You pay what you owe." Robert had forgotten that lesson. He was terrified. He was a drowning man, thrashing in the water, looking for anything to pull him up. "The house," Marcus said, rubbing his chin. "Elmwood Drive is fully paid off. In today's market in that neighborhood, it's worth at least $800,000. "Exactly," Chloe nodded. "If they can get Mrs. Vega declared legally incompetent and committed to a facility by next Friday, Robert gains immediate control of her estate. He can take out a massive equity line of credit against the house, replace the stolen $215,000 before the auditors find out, and save himself from prison. Audrey isn't just being greedy. She's trying to keep her husband out of a federal penitentiary and save her own luxurious lifestyle." Helen stood up and walked to the motel window. She pulled the heavy curtain back an inch, looking out at the flashing neon light of the parking lot. The revelation didn't soften her anger. It calcified it into something cold and unbreakable. Her son had measured the value of his mother's freedom, her sanity, and her life, and decided it was worth exactly $215,000. He was willing to lock her in a dementia ward, drugged and confused, so he wouldn't have to wear an orange jumpsuit. "They booked a private medical evaluation with that quack doctor for next Friday," Helen said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "But Saturday night is when they make their real money on the house, isn't it, Chloe?" "Yes, ma'am." Chloe checked her screen. "The Airbnb calendar is fully booked for this coming weekend. They have a bachelor party of 8 guys checking in on Friday afternoon and staying through Sunday. They're charging them $800 a night." Helen turned back to face Marcus, a tactical blueprint already forming in her mind. "Marcus, I need you to draft the eviction notices. But more importantly, I need you to bring the paperwork for the trust, the one we set up after Thomas died." Marcus's eyes widened slightly, and then a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. The irrevocable trust. The ultimate shield Thomas and Marcus had built decades ago, which Robert knew absolutely nothing about. "Helen, if we use the trust, it's nuclear," Marcus warned gently. "There is no walking it back. It will sever his rights permanently." "He severed his rights the moment he put a sedative in my tea," Helen replied, her voice like cracking ice. "Here is the plan. We wait. Let them host their little bachelor party on Friday. Let them think I am safely tucked away in Chicago. On Saturday night, when that house is full of illegal tenants, loud music, and a driveway full of cars, we strike." For the next 3 days, Helen remained in room 114. It was a self-imposed purgatory. She spent her time watching the camera feeds. She watched Audrey meticulously clean the house, preparing it for the weekend guests. She watched Robert pace the living room late at night, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking like a ghost haunting a house he didn't own. Sometimes Helen had to mute the audio. The cognitive dissonance of seeing her child, the baby she had nursed, the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged, operating as a callous criminal was almost too much to bear. But she forced herself to watch. She needed to memorize their faces, their casual cruelty, to ensure her resolve didn't waver when the time came. On Friday afternoon, the guests arrived. Through the hidden camera in the living room, Helen watched as 8 rowdy men in their late 20s piled into her home, carrying cases of beer, portable speakers, and duffel bags. Robert played the perfect host, handing over the keys with a bright, welcoming smile. Audrey stood by his side, pointing out the amenities, reminding them to keep the noise down after midnight. Once the guests were settled on the second floor, Robert and Audrey retreated to the small guest house in the backyard, a converted garage they used as their base of operations when the main house was rented out. Friday night passed with thumping bass and the sound of drunken laughter echoing through Helen's sacred halls. She watched a stranger spill beer on Thomas's hardwood floors. She watched another put his muddy boots on her custom-upholstered sofa. Saturday arrived, humid and thick with impending storms. At 6 p.m., Marcus Vance pulled his black Mercedes sedan into the Starlight Motel parking lot. Chloe was in the passenger seat. Helen walked out of room 114. She had abandoned the comfortable oversized sweaters she had worn while pretending to be sick. Tonight she wore a sharp tailored navy blue pantsuit, the same suit she used to wear when facing down hostile hospital administrators. Her silver hair was elegantly styled. She wore her pearls. She looked regal, terrifying, and utterly unshakable. She got into the back seat of the Mercedes. "Are the documents ready?" Helen asked. Marcus handed her a thick manila folder. "Everything is signed, sealed, and stamped by the Fulton County judge. Eviction notices, the trust declaration, and a restraining order preventing Robert and Audrey from accessing your bank accounts or medical records, effective immediately." "And the police?" "Chloe made the call 10 minutes ago," Marcus said, putting the car into gear. "We reported a severe noise disturbance and suspected illegal commercial activity at Elmwood Drive. 2 squad cars will be meeting us at the end of your block." Helen looked out the window as the motel disappeared behind them, replaced by the familiar tree-lined streets of her neighborhood. The street lamps flickered to life against the darkening twilight sky. "Mrs. Vega," Chloe said softly from the front seat, looking back at her. "Are you ready for this? It's going to get ugly." Helen touched the strand of pearls at her neck. Thomas had given them to her on their wedding day. "My ancestors survived chains, Chloe," Helen said, her voice steady and resolute. "I survived 40 years in a trauma ward. I survived the death of the only man I ever loved. 2 greedy children playing house with my legacy don't scare me. Take me home, Marcus." The black Mercedes glided silently down Elmwood Drive, a sleek predator closing in on its prey. As they approached the house, the noise was undeniable. The bachelor party was in full swing. Bright lights blazed from every window on the second floor. A heavy bass line rattled the glass panes. Several unfamiliar cars were parked haphazardly on the pristine lawn Helen had paid landscapers to maintain. 2 Atlanta Police Department cruisers were already parked near the driveway, their blue lights strobing silently against the neighborhood trees, casting an eerie, rhythmic glow over the chaotic scene. Marcus parked the car. He and Chloe stepped out, flanked by the 2 uniformed officers who had been waiting for them. Helen opened her door. She stepped onto the pavement, the cool evening air bracing against her skin. She looked up at the house. It was no longer a place of warmth. It was a crime scene. And she was the judge, jury, and executioner. "Officers," Marcus said, presenting his legal credentials. "Thank you for responding. My client is the legal owner of this property. We are here to remove trespassers and serve eviction notices to her estranged relatives." "Lead the way, Mr. Vance," the taller officer said, adjusting his utility belt. Helen walked up the front path. She didn't use her key. She didn't need to. She balled her hand into a fist and pounded on the heavy oak door with the force of a woman reclaiming her kingdom. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed over the pulsing music. Inside, the trap was set. The jaws were about to snap shut, and Robert and Audrey had no idea that the prey they thought they had hunted was actually the apex predator coming to collect her due. The heavy oak door reverberated under Helen's fist. Inside, the muffled thumping of the bass suddenly cut out, replaced by a chaotic scramble of voices. The door swung open, revealing a shirtless young man holding a red Solo cup, his eyes wide and glassy. "Whoa, hey!" the young man slurred, blinking at the 2 police officers standing behind a very sharply dressed, very angry older black woman. The host is out back. We're just renting the place for the weekend, swear to God." "I am aware," Helen said, her voice cutting through his drunken haze like a scalpel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The sheer authority radiating from her made the young man step aside automatically. "Gather your friends. Gather your belongings. You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate my property before these officers arrest you for trespassing." The young man's jaw dropped. "But we paid $800. "Take it up with the person you paid," Marcus Vance interjected smoothly, stepping into the foyer. 15 minutes, son. The clock is ticking." Helen strode into her house, Marcus, Chloe, and the officers trailing behind her. The living room was a disaster. Empty beer cans littered the mahogany coffee table. A pizza box sat open on her custom-upholstered armchair. But Helen didn't look at the mess. She walked straight past the bewildered bachelor party guests and headed for the kitchen, marching toward the back door that led to the guest house. Before she could reach the handle, the door burst open. Robert rushed in, out of breath, his face flushed with panic. He must have seen the flashing police lights from the backyard window. Audrey was right on his heels, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled. "Officers, what is going on here?" Robert demanded, trying to project the confidence of a homeowner. "We are the residents of this property. There's been a Robert stopped dead. The words caught in his throat like broken glass. His eyes landed on Helen. She wasn't wearing the oversized sweater. She wasn't hunched over. She wasn't staring blankly into space. She stood tall, her spine rigid, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Mom?" Robert whispered, the blood draining from his face so fast he looked as though he might faint. You're in Chicago." "Hello, Robert," Helen said evenly. "No, I am not in Chicago. I have been at a motel 3 blocks away watching you defile your father's house." Audrey pushed past her frozen husband, trying to salvage the situation. "Mama Helen, you're confused. You've had an episode. Officers, my mother-in-law suffers from severe cognitive decline. She's not well. She wandered off days ago. We've been terrified." "Save the performance, Audrey," Helen interrupted, her voice slicing through the lie. "There is no cognitive decline, but there is a very impressive cocktail of diphenhydramine and lorazepam that you've been slipping into my chamomile tea every night." Audrey physically recoiled, gasping as if she had been struck. The air in the kitchen evaporated. Helen pulled the toxicology report from her purse and slammed it onto the granite countertop. The sharp smack echoed in the silent room. "I took a sample of your special herbal blend to the lab at Atlanta General. I know exactly what you've been doing. I know you tried to chemically restrain me." Robert staggered back, hitting the refrigerator. "Mom, I didn't know. I thought it was just to help you sleep." "Do not lie to me in my own house, Robert Vega." Helen's voice finally cracked like thunder. The raw, guttural pain of a betrayed mother shattered her cold exterior. "I saw the emails. I saw the correspondence with Dr. Aries. I watched the hidden camera footage from my bedroom. I watched you throw my clothes on the floor. I watched you shatter the photograph of you and your father." Robert covered his face with his hands, a pathetic, strangled sob escaping his throat. "Officers," Marcus Vance stepped forward, his tone completely professional. "These individuals have been operating an unlicensed commercial lodging facility on this property without the owner's consent. They are also subjects of an active investigation for elder abuse and fraud. For tonight, Mrs. Vega simply wants them removed from the premises." The taller officer nodded, turning his attention to Robert and Audrey. "You folks need to pack a bag and leave, now." Audrey's shock was rapidly morphing into desperate, cornered fury. The carefully constructed mask of the loving daughter-in-law fell away completely, revealing the venomous opportunist beneath. "You can't kick us out," Audrey shrieked, her voice shrill and grating. "We established residency here. We've lived here for a year. The law requires a 30-day formal eviction process. You can't just throw us on the street tonight. I know my rights." She turned to the officers, pointing a shaking finger at Helen. "She's crazy. She's paranoid. We have a medical evaluation scheduled for her next Friday. My husband is her next of kin. He has the right to manage this property for her own safety." Marcus Vance let out a low, humorless chuckle. It was the sound of a lawyer who had just been handed the winning card. "Oh, Mrs. Vega," Marcus said smoothly, looking at Audrey with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You have fundamentally misunderstood who owns this house." He snapped his fingers. Chloe stepped forward, opening the thick leather binder. She handed a document with a heavy gold seal to the police officer and another copy to Robert. "What is this?" Robert whispered, staring at the legal jargon through tear-filled eyes. "That, Robert, is the Elmwood Irrevocable Trust," Marcus announced, his voice booming through the kitchen. "Set up by your father, Thomas Vega, and your mother, Helen Vega, 10 years ago. Your mother does not technically own this house. The trust owns this house. Your mother is simply the sole lifetime beneficiary." Robert looked up, his confusion momentarily overriding his panic. I don't understand." Helen took a step closer to her son. The fire in her eyes had died down, replaced by a tragic, final sort of sorrow. "Your father knew you, Bobby. He loved you, but he knew you had a weakness for the easy way out. He knew you liked to gamble with things you couldn't afford to lose." She gestured to the document in his shaking hands. "If you had succeeded in getting me declared incompetent, the court would not have given you this house. The trust strictly dictates that upon my incapacitation or death, The property is immediately transferred to a charitable foundation funding nursing scholarships for Black women in Atlanta. You were never getting the house, Robert. You committed felony fraud, you poisoned your own mother, all for a prize that didn't even exist. The realization hit Robert like a physical blow. He dropped the paper. His knees buckled and he sank to the kitchen floor, weeping openly, the pathetic wails of a broken, ruined man. Audrey stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. No, that can't be true. We need this house. The audit. Yes. The audit, Chloe spoke up, her voice light but laced with steel. She closed her laptop. Sterling and Hayes Investments. The missing $215,000. We know about that too, Audrey. Did you really think you could outsmart a trauma nurse and a senior partner at a law firm? Audrey backed away, her eyes darting frantically toward the back door, as if searching for an escape route from her crumbling reality. Get out, Helen commanded, her voice dropping to a low, absolute register. Pack what you can carry. The rest will be boxed and sent to whatever address you manage to find. You are no longer welcome in this house. You are no longer welcome in my life. Mom, please! Robert crawled toward her on his knees, reaching for the hem of her slacks. Please, I'm going to prison. I'll lose everything. You're my mother. You have to help me. Helen looked down at the man sobbing at her feet. For a agonizing second, the maternal instinct, the instinct to protect, to shield, to fix, flared in her chest. It was a biological imperative, forged over 35 years. It would have been so easy to bend, to offer a sliver of grace. But then she remembered the heavy, suffocating fog. She remembered the shattered glass over Thomas's smiling face. She remembered that love, true love, required accountability. She stepped back, pulling her pant leg away from his grasp. I taught you how to stand on your own 2 feet, Robert, Helen said, her voice trembling slightly but never breaking. But I never taught you to climb on my back to survive. The legacy your father and I built is soaked in our sweat, our tears, and our dignity. You do not get to desecrate it because you lack a spine. She looked away, turning her back on him. Officers, please escort them to their rooms to pack. If they resist, arrest them. The next hour was a blur of chaotic, grim efficiency. The bachelor party guests hauled their duffel bags out the front door, muttering curses and demanding refunds. Robert and Audrey dragged 4 large suitcases down the stairs. Audrey was crying now, tears of pure, furious humiliation ruining her makeup. Robert looked like a hollow shell. When they reached the front door, Robert stopped. He looked back at Helen, who stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by Marcus and Chloe. I'm sorry, Mom, Robert whispered. I know you are, Robert, Helen replied softly. But you're only sorry because you got caught. Goodbye. The heavy oak door shut with a definitive echoing thud. The house was quiet. The pulsing bass was gone. The toxic presence of Audrey and the desperate cowardice of Robert had been excised. It was just Helen, Marcus, and Chloe standing amidst the wreckage of a bachelor party and a broken family. Are you all right, Helen? Marcus asked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Helen looked around the living room. It was messy, yes, but the air felt clean. The suffocating fog that had hung over the house, both chemical and emotional, had finally lifted. I will be, Helen said. We filed a police report regarding the poisoning and the elder abuse on Monday morning, Marcus stated, returning to his pragmatic, lawyerly tone. The district attorney will have a field day with Dr. Aris. As for Robert and the embezzlement, well, the FBI will likely handle that. Helen nodded slowly. She walked over to the nightstand where the shattered remains of the silver frame still lay on the floor. She knelt down carefully, picking up the photograph. The glass was broken, but the picture of her and Thomas remained intact. They were still smiling. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Chloe, Helen said, standing up. I'd like to be alone now. Marcus nodded in understanding. Call me if you need anything, Helen. Any time. When the lawyers left, Helen walked through her empty house. She opened all the windows, letting the cool night air rush in, sweeping away the stale smell of beer and lies. She walked into the kitchen, picked up the box of special herbal blend tea, and threw it directly into the trash can. Then she went to her bedroom. She didn't lock the door. There was no one left to hide from. She placed the photograph of her and Thomas gently on the dresser. She looked at her reflection in the mirror above it. She looked older, yes. The lines around her eyes were deeper, carved by the kind of grief that never truly fades. But her eyes were bright. Her mind was sharp. She was not a victim. She was Helen Vega, head nurse, guardian of Elmwood Drive, and the fierce protector of her own life. She turned off the light, got into bed, and for the first time in a month, she fell into a deep, natural, and completely undisturbed sleep. The legacy was safe. The shadows were gone. 6 months later, the oppressive Georgia heat had finally broken, surrendering to the crisp, golden bite of autumn. The leaves on the massive oak trees lining Elmwood Drive had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, carpeting the immaculate lawns in a mosaic of fire. Inside Helen's house, the air was entirely different than it had been half a year ago. It smelled of lemon oil, fresh linen, and the faint, comforting aroma of cinnamon. The shadows that had once clung to the corners of the rooms, thickened by deceit and chemical fog, were gone. The house felt lighter. It felt like it was breathing again. Helen stood in the kitchen, carefully pouring boiling water over a loose-leaf blend of Darjeeling tea. No chamomile, no valerian root, and certainly no sedatives. Just the sharp, clean bite of black tea. The doorbell rang, a crisp chime that no longer brought her a sense of impending dread. Helen wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the front foyer, opening the heavy oak door. Marcus Vance stood on the porch, wearing a tweed coat against the autumn chill, a sleek leather briefcase in his hand. He smiled, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Helen," Marcus said, stepping inside and taking a deep breath. "Something smells wonderful. Are you baking?" "Cinnamon rolls. The recipe Thomas used to make on Sunday mornings," Helen said, taking his coat. "Come into the kitchen, Marcus. I just brewed some tea." They sat at the granite island. For a moment it felt like decades ago, when Marcus and Thomas would sit at this very counter, arguing about civil rights legislation and local politics while Helen rolled out pie crusts. But the gray in Marcus's hair and the quiet stillness of the house anchored them firmly in the present. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had successfully excised a tumor, relieved but keenly aware of the toll the surgery had taken. "The final gavel came down yesterday," Marcus began, his baritone voice steady and gentle. "I wanted to tell you in person." Helen wrapped her hands around her warm mug. She looked out the window at the guest house in the backyard, which had been permanently locked and emptied. "Tell me." "Dr. Aris took a plea deal," Marcus said. "When the district attorney presented him with your toxicology report, his emails with Robert, and the forged evaluation documents, he folded immediately. He surrendered his medical license to avoid prison time, but he's facing 5 years of heavily monitored probation and a crippling civil fine. He will never practice medicine or evaluate another elder ever again." Helen nodded slowly. "Good. He was a predator hiding behind a white coat. And Audrey?" "Audrey tried to turn state's witness," Marcus said, a hint of disdain curling the edge of his lip. "She tried to pin the entire embezzlement scheme and the drugging on Robert, claiming she was a victim of a controlling husband. The FBI didn't buy it. Chloe found the digital receipts. Audrey was the one who purchased the lorazepam online from an illicit pharmacy in Canada. She's been indicted for conspiracy to commit elder abuse and fraud. She's currently out on bail, living in a cramped studio apartment in Marietta, awaiting trial." Helen took a sip of her tea. It tasted perfect. "And Robert?" The name hung in the air. The name of the boy she had carried for 9 months, the boy she had protected, the man who had tried to bury her alive. "Robert formally pled guilty to federal wire fraud and embezzlement," Marcus said softly, watching Helen's face carefully for any sign of a break. "Because he cooperated with the internal auditors at Sterling and Hayes, the judge showed slight leniency. He was sentenced to 7 years in a minimum security federal correctional institution in Florida. He transferred there on Tuesday." Helen looked down at the dark amber liquid in her cup. 7 years. He would be 42 when he got out. A felon, stripped of his career, his marriage, and his inheritance. The boy who had everything had gambled it all away because he lacked the moral spine to simply ask for help. "Did he look at you in the courtroom?" Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He did," Marcus replied. "When the judge read the sentence, he turned around and looked at the gallery. I think he was looking for you, Helen." "I couldn't go, Marcus. I couldn't watch him put the chains on himself," she said, a single tear escaping the corner of her eye, tracing the deep lines of her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. It was the last tear she intended to shed for Robert Vega. You did the right thing, Helen. Marcus reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. You survived. You protected Thomas's legacy. And more importantly, you protected yourself. Helen offered a small, fractured smile. Speaking of the legacy, I have an appointment at noon today. The paperwork you drafted for the trust. The foundation is ready? Marcus beamed, tapping the manila envelope. Fully funded and legally unassailable. The Thomas and Helen Vega endowment is officially recognized. At noon, Helen walked through the sliding glass doors of Atlanta General Hospital. It was the first time she had been back since the day she brought the poisoned tea to Sarah in the toxicology lab. She wasn't sneaking through the back entrance this time. She walked proudly through the main lobby, her heels clicking authoritatively against the polished linoleum. She was directed to the administrative wing, where the chief of nursing and the hospital director were waiting for her in a sunlit boardroom. Sarah was there too, having traded her lab coat for a formal dress. When Helen walked in, Sarah pulled her into a fierce, tight hug. "Look at you, Queen of the ER," Sarah whispered. "You look like $1,000,000. "I feel like I've been through a war, Sarah, but I'm still standing." Helen smiled, taking her seat at the head of the long mahogany table. The hospital director cleared his throat, holding a leather-bound folder. "Mrs. Vega, words cannot express our gratitude. Your initial endowment of $100,000, leveraging the equity of your estate, is one of the most generous private gifts our nursing program has ever received." "It is not a gift, Director," Helen corrected him politely but firmly. "It is an investment. I spent 40 years in this hospital. I know what it takes to survive in these halls, especially for young women of color. The Thomas and Helen Vega Endowment is designed to provide full-ride scholarships, living stipends, and mental health support for Black female nursing students who show exceptional promise but lack the financial backing to finish their rotations." The door to the boardroom opened timidly. A young woman in her early 20s stepped in. She was wearing blue scrubs, her hair pulled back in neat braids. She looked exhausted, carrying the specific kind of heavy-eyed fatigue that only a double shift in a trauma ward could produce. But her eyes were bright, intelligent, and fiercely determined. "Ah, Maya, come in." The chief of nursing smiled. "Mrs. Vega, I'd like to introduce you to Maya Caldwell. She is a third-year nursing student, top of her clinical class. She has been working nights as an orderly to pay her tuition. She is the first official recipient of your endowment." Maya walked over, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her scrub top. She looked at Helen with a mixture of profound awe and overwhelming relief. "Mrs. Vega," Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. I was going to have to drop out next semester. My mother got sick, and the medical bills. I couldn't afford the tuition anymore. When they told me about the scholarship yesterday, I sat in the locker room and cried for an hour. Thank you. I don't know how I will ever repay you." Helen stood up. She looked at the young woman. She saw the same fire, the same desperate ambition, and the same terrifying vulnerability that she had possessed at 22, when she and Thomas were fighting for scraps in a world designed to keep them out. Helen reached out and took Maya's hands. They were strong hands, calloused, capable. "You don't repay me, Maya," Helen said, her voice rich with decades of hard-earned wisdom. "You pay it forward. You learn every machine, you memorize every protocol, and you fight for your patients when no one else will. You stand your ground. You build a life that no one can ever take away from you. Do you understand?" Maya nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, ma'am, I promise." Helen smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. In this young stranger, she saw the continuation of her bloodline. Not a biological continuation, but a continuation of spirit. Robert had chosen to inherit the world's greed. Maya was inheriting Helen's resilience. The legacy of Elmwood Drive was no longer trapped within the walls of a house. It was walking the halls of the hospital, saving lives. Later that evening, Helen returned home. She checked the ornate brass mailbox by the front door. Inside was a single envelope. The return address was stamped with the seal of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It was from Robert. Helen walked into the kitchen, set her purse down, and stared at the envelope. For weeks she had dreaded this moment. She had wondered if she would tear it up unread, or if she would burn it in the fireplace. But as she stood there, surrounded by the quiet peace of her home, she realized she wasn't afraid of his words anymore. The ghost had been exorcised. She grabbed a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open. The handwriting was messy, erratic. the penmanship of a man who had lost his center of gravity. Mom, I don't expect you to reply to this. I don't expect you to forgive me. I am sitting in a cell that is 8 feet by 10 feet, and I have 7 years to think about what I've done. But I couldn't let another day pass without telling you the truth. I am a coward. I was terrified of losing my job, of going to prison, of Audrey leaving me. When the audit was announced, I panicked. Audrey came up with the plan for the house and the doctor, but I let her do it. I poured that tea. I watched you fade away, and I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would make it up to you once I had the money. I lied to myself so I wouldn't have to look in the mirror and see a monster. When you stood in that kitchen and showed me the irrevocable trust, when I realized Dad had known my weakness even before I did, it broke me. But it also woke me up. You were always the strongest person I knew. I resented you for it because I knew I could never measure up. I thought taking your power would give me my own. I was wrong. I have lost everything, Mom. My freedom, my wife, my career, but the only thing that actually keeps me awake at night, staring at this concrete ceiling, is the memory of breaking that picture frame. I destroyed the only beautiful thing left in my life. I am so sorry, Mom. I am so deeply, unspeakably sorry. I will spend the rest of my life trying to become a fraction of the man Dad wanted me to be. Love, Robert. Helen read the letter twice. There was no manipulation in it, no plea for her to write the judge, no request for commissary money, no shifting of the blame. It was a raw, bleeding confession. She folded the letter slowly. She walked into her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her antique mahogany dresser. Inside was a beautiful cedar keepsake box. She opened it. Inside rested the photograph of her and Thomas, which she had carefully placed in a new, unblemished silver frame. Beside it lay the toxicology report, a reminder of the darkness. Helen placed Robert's letter gently next to the photograph. "I forgive you, Bobby," Helen whispered into the quiet room. "May God have mercy on your soul. But I cannot save you. You have to save yourself now." She closed the cedar box. By forgiving him, she wasn't excusing the crime, nor was she inviting him back into her life. She was simply releasing the poison from her own heart. She refused to carry the heavy, suffocating weight of hatred into the final chapters of her life. She was traveling light from now on. The next morning, Helen woke up at 6 a.m. The house was perfectly still, bathed in the soft, pre-dawn indigo light. She felt no stiffness in her joints, no fog in her mind. She put on a thick, comfortable cashmere robe and walked down to the kitchen. She brewed a cup of strong Earl Grey tea, the steam curling into the cool air. She unbolted the front door and stepped out onto the magnificent wraparound porch. Helen sat in her favorite wicker rocking chair. She pulled her robe tight against the autumn chill and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug. Before her, Elmwood Drive was slowly waking up. The street lamps flickered off. The sky above the massive oak trees began to bleed from deep purple into brilliant shades of pink, gold, and vibrant orange. A flock of starlings took flight, moving as one fluid, unbroken wave against the dawn. Helen took a deep breath, tasting the crisp air. They thought I was a fragile thing, she thought, watching the sun crest the horizon. They looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled hands, and they saw a victim. They saw a stepping stone. They forgot where I come from. She thought of her grandmother, who had worked as a domestic servant, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees so her children could go to school. She thought of her mother, who had marched through tear gas and police dogs just to secure the right to vote. She thought of herself, a young black nurse in the 1970s, fighting tooth and nail for respect in a hospital system run by men who thought she belonged in the laundry room. This house is not just wood and stone, Helen reflected, her eyes scanning the expansive, dew-covered lawn. It is blood. It is sweat. It is the physical manifestation of generational defiance. We were never supposed to own anything in this country, let alone a fortress. She had learned the hardest lesson a mother could ever learn. Motherhood does not require martyrdom. Giving a child life does not mean giving them permission to slowly take yours away. Love could be a shield, yes, but self-respect had to be the sword. She had used that sword to cut away the rot. It had hurt. It had left a scar that would ache when it rained, a phantom limb of the son she had lost to greed. But the amputation had saved her life. Helen took a long, slow sip of her tea. It was bitter, strong, and utterly real. The sun broke fully over the trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the porch, illuminating Helen Vega in her quiet majesty. She was 68 years old. She was a widow. She was a mother who had survived the ultimate betrayal. But as she sat there, watching the world wake up around her, she realized she was something else too. She was free. And the dawn belonged entirely to her.